And we are back on Capitol Tonight. The saga of the on-again, off-again, maybe on-again PEF contract has raised a new set of questions about the relationship between the state and organized labor. You'll recall that PEF workers voted down the first version of the contract, a contract very similar to an agreement that CSEA members approved over the summer. And now PEF members are voting on the second version of the contract. Depending on the outcome of this vote, other unions might be taking notes on this strategy. My next guest was a labor leader before she was elected to the state Senate. Diane Savino is joining me from New York City. Senator, it is a pleasure.
How are you, Liz?
I am well. It's great to see you. So you've actually commented a couple of times on this whole PEF negotiation situation, but do you think that the governor could have a problem going forward with other unions like Council 82 or UUP, who I've already spoken to PEF, are in contact with them about how they might proceed?
Well, I don't know if I would describe it as a problem, but certainly the governor's going to have to be a little bit more creative, perhaps, with Council 82. If you'll recall, they had negotiated a contract with Council 82 earlier in the year, only to see that contract go down.
Right.
CSEA then negotiated, and that was successfully passed. And then, of course, PEF, had a different outcome. And UUP tends to be somewhat more militant in terms of their bargaining position. They're a different group of people. But, my history in collective bargaining in New York State is pattern bargaining does have a very big role to play in this, and so while you may see some variations of the contracts that CSEA ultimately negotiated applied differently to the other bargaining units, at the end they're probably going to be equal in some way, shape, or form.
Well, what does that mean exactly? I mean, certainly the PEF contract, for example, it's 4 years as opposed to the CSEA contract being 5 years, and I've talked to a number of people, but doesn't that put them in a better bargaining position because they get to go back to the table ostensibly when the state, hopefully, the state's economic picture is improved?
6 of one, half dozen of the other, Liz. The truth is, a 5-year you could make the argument that a 5-year contract is better. It actually gets you into the next gubernatorial administration, and you're off the table for next year's budget and the next budget and the next one. You would be negotiating with the next governor of the state. We'll assume it's going to be Andrew Cuomo, but anything could happen. He could run for president. But anything is possible.
Indeed.
So you negotiate a contract at a time. At the end of this process, I think what we're going to see is that the PEF contract and the CSEA contract are similar in some ways. Both unions would argue that they have the better deal, and I'll leave that up to the members to decide. But I was quite frankly not surprised that the PEF contract was voted down. I think a critical mistake that was made was that the administration sent out layoff notices in the midst of the negotiating process. Well, if the threat to the PEF members was, or the PEF leadership was, negotiate or we're going to lay off 3,500 of your members, well, you have a union of 55,000 people. 52,000 now knew they weren't being targeted for layoffs. So you almost set up the dynamic where people were going to vote no.
Yeah,
and for PEF, the costs were slightly different, and in fact they were higher. They're members that are higher education, higher salary. They were going to pay a higher percentage of the givebacks, and they rejected it.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, though, is, and I think that you're probably, I understand the logic, which is to say, okay, 52,000 versus 3,500, it's not my hide, so what do I care? But, labor likes to talk about it itself as like, they call one another brother and sister, as like a family of supporting members, and this sort of undercuts that argument, does it not? Particularly at a time when labor is trying to present this united front when it comes to the Occupy Wall Street movement, when it comes to going into a presidential election, when people are always talking about how labor's losing its clout.
Well, I think the Occupy Wall Street movement and the rejection of some of these contracts are not that dissimilar from one another. Organized labor is feeling the pressure from, the economists and the so-called, masters of the universe who wrecked our economy, who basically said that what's wrong with our economy is not any of the malfeasance on Wall Street or the banks or bad economic policies. It's working people expecting to be paid a decent salary and having benefits into their old age. And what we've really seen with respect to public employees, and that's probably because there are more unionized public employees now than private employees, they're really bearing the brunt. The attacks on workers in Wisconsin, the attacks in Ohio, and the attacks in New Jersey, After a while, people stand up and say enough. So you have young people down on Wall Street saying enough is enough with this inherently unfair tax code and how it applies to everyone. You have public employees saying enough is enough and almost willing to sacrifice some of their brothers and sisters to take a stand and say, we're not going to take it anymore.
Doesn't that put your fellow Democrats, politicians in general, but particularly the Democrats, in something of a bind, Andrew Cuomo included? Because you have folks who say, I understand the frustration of Occupy Wall Street, and even to some degree that, for example, Steve Israel, the DCCC chairman, sending out emails urging everyone to get on board with Occupy Wall Street, and at the same time going to those very people targeted by Occupy Wall Street, the Wall Street bankers, for campaign cash.
Consistency being the hobgoblin of small minds, let's set that aside. I think the Democratic Party, particularly on the national level, is looking at this Occupy Wall Street movement and saying this may be our Tea Party, looking at how the Republicans, co-opted the Tea Party 2 years ago and, they helped take them into power.
Right.
I have a sense the Occupy Wall Street people are not like the Tea Party. They're not looking for leaders. They're not looking to be co-opted by anybody, and quite frankly, they don't have a single, concise message, other than the income inequality that many people in America face. That they're the 99%. But that 99% encompasses an awful lot of people. I think there's a danger to anyone trying to insinuate that they're delivering their message, whether it be organized labor, whether it be the Democratic Party, whether it be the Libertarians, whether it be anybody, actually.
Just two quick points. If that is indeed the case, then this push by organized labor to get on board the momentum with Occupy Wall Street and in somehow pressure Governor Cuomo on the so-called millionaires tax won't work if what you're saying is true, that they can't be co-opted, that they don't have a message, and that there is no cohesive group of people to organize.
I tend to think that's going to be the outcome. I mean, if the labor movement, or we should say the public sector labor movement, wants to make the argument to the governor that we should not allow the high earner tax to expire, it should be about the high earner tax and what it means to the state of New York. We're going to have a $2 billion deficit next year. By anyone's estimation. And in this precarious economy, anything could affect that. But we're looking at a $2 billion budget deficit. The governor has made a commitment to education and health care that they're going to get a 4% increase.
He has.
Well, if the revenue's not there for that, we're going to have to find it. And you can only, talk about efficiencies in government so much. We're at the lowest point in the state workforce that we've been in a very long time. And as I remind people all the time, just because the workers go away doesn't mean the work does. So we still have to accomplish the mandates and the missions of these agencies. We have to provide police service and fire service and transportation. And if we don't have enough revenue and we have commitments to education and health care, he may have to revisit his position. But that should be the way you make that argument, based upon our needs.
Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I do want to say this. One of the reasons why reporters like myself like to talk to you so much is because you tell it like it is, and you don't shy away from hard questions. And the hard question is, what do you have against Snooki?
It's not about Snooki.
I know.
And I want people to really focus on this. We in government spend tens of millions of dollars every year trying to raise public awareness about things like binge drinking and alcoholism and teen dating violence and sexual promiscuity and, out of wedlock pregnancy and drunk driving. And here we have a young woman who, in my opinion, is a very troubled young woman who is being exploited on a weekly basis by First MTV. She's made a career out of self-degradation and engaging in really risky behavior, and we shouldn't be glorifying that. And it's, I hope she gets the help that she needs someday, and I hope she saves some of the money she's made. But, we have retailers who are looking to exploit her fame in an effort to bolster their, economic bottom line. I think they need to re-examine their business model if that's the only way they can make a buck. She is not a good example for young women. I hope that one day that will change for her, but certainly we shouldn't be celebrating her behavior.
And this is why, of course, you have come out in opposition to her planned appearance at a mall in Staten Island, which is in your district, it is encompassed in your entire district, actually, and also why you are so popular on Facebook. So I want to congratulate you. You're hitting that 5,000 mark.
Yes, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Thank you.
And thanks for coming on. Be well.
You're welcome. Thanks, Liz.